Hey everybody, what's going on YouTube? Motley Jam back again doing the one and only video I'm going to do on Dungeons and Dragons, the name brand. Why do I call it that? Because Dungeons and Dragons to me has now become just a name brand more than anything, in the same vein that Kleenex is synonymous with tissues. Dungeons & Dragons is synonymous with tabletop gaming. So I consider it a name brand. In this video, I'm going to address why I don't personally play it, but still try to give some tips to people who continue and want to continue playing this particular game. Now, I'm not going into an exhaustive history. I'm not going to cover every edition or anything, but suffice to say, at least in America, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in 1974 put out Dungeons & Dragons. That's the white box edition, I believe, or the zero edition, or however you want to say it, if I remember correctly. I might be a little wrong there. Historians, please correct me in the comments below. However, this game was, as far as I can tell, as far as what I can tell from what I've looked at, is the first commercially successful game of its type in America. It spawned TSR, and then, of course, from then, hands got changed multiple times. Now it's under Hasbro through Wizards of the Coast, or maybe the other way around. Either way, it is now owned by a major corporation who is more concerned about the legacy of the name and how they can move that forward into the future, which it is what it is. But that's what it is now. So we do have to give Dungeons & Dragons credit where credit's due. It's a D20 system at its core, and its very core rules are still relatively simple. It is synonymous with the game, so anywhere you go, most of the time people will understand what a tabletop game is if you ask them or even mention Dungeons & Dragons. So you can't knock it for being in that place. That's just where it is. In America, it was the first. It spawned many people into the realm of fantasy and tabletop games. And it was, for most of us, the first tabletop game that we encountered, myself included. In a previous video, I told you about my experience there, which started in 1986. But Dungeons & Dragons was definitely the first one. It brought forth fantasy artwork, and some of the most famous fantasy artists got brought out through D&D. You know, you really have to give it credit where credit's due. Even if we don't like its current form or where it's going, the past is still there. And without Dungeons & Dragons, in America at least, tabletop gaming wouldn't look the way it is today, and we wouldn't have the beautiful community that we have now. So we'll give it credit for that. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. One of the big reasons and one of the things that Dungeons & Dragons have had to deal with is our modern day sensibilities. Now, we have to face it. The unfortunate fact of the matter is a lot of things that came out from the time that this came out still were saturated in ideologies that I personally have never really been a fan of, and is becoming more apparent these days how negative those ideologies are. Now, I'm not here to give any moral discussions to anybody. I can only go off of the way I think about these things. And I think it does come down to, you have to separate the art from the artist in this case, because we can't take away their ideologies, but we can remove it from the game. Now, unfortunately, to do that in Dungeons & Dragons proper, that takes some work. But if we really want to move forward, getting rid of some of those racist and misogynistic ideologies and removing them from the game is important. I would even say imperative to how we move forward with the game. We can still have fantasy and take out old racist and misogynistic tropes and still have a wonderful time playing fantasy. And that's something I encourage on my channel. I have been against those ideas since before it was cool to be against those ideas. So for me, that's something I've always tried to do. And one of the downsides to Dungeons & Dragons is how much rewriting or redoing I had to do to the game to take those things out. And required a lot of homebrewing and a lot of explaining in some cases. So having to do that was a negative for me to continue with the game, but it is something we should do. If we don't do it in this game particularly, again, I've left this one behind, but in the OSRs coming up, they're doing a really good job of that. So we have to give it credit for that too. It did spawn the OSR and gave us the old school game style with modern sensibilities. And I think that's a good thing in the end. I think that's positive. The other thing about Dungeons and Dragons, like I hinted to before, it's owned by a major corporation whose bottom line is going to be their priority. And let's face it, they're not going to target people like me. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm already kind of set in the ways that I like to do things in certain things. I like to be flexible, but and they're not looking to me as a target audience. They're not looking to the people that were playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s or even the 90s and so on to see the future. They're looking towards children and people who aren't even old enough to be into this so far yet. And when they want to bring them into the fold, they want to make sure they bring them into their little micro universe. So, I guess what I'm trying to say at the end of the day is corporate is going to corporate, man, and their job is to try to make money, and they're going to do that by using trends and sales records and all kinds of things to make that the most important thing, and that will hurt the game in the end, in my opinion, once again. So, corporates are going to corporate. That's what owns this now, and it's a brand, it's a name, and what do they want to do with it? They want it to be a lifestyle brand. They want it to use its default tabletop recognition, and they want to harness that to make it a lifestyle brand. Now, we can leverage that in a couple ways, of course. It still introduces people into the hobby, and those of us that have broken off and prefer more independent gaming, more gaming that's centered around what the old tabletop game was really more about, then this is a good gateway to it, and we can use it as such. But at the end of the day, I really feel, even for brand new people to TTRPGs, this doesn't do it the best. I felt others did it better. So I'm not going to go into exhaustive history of D&D, like I said, nor my own. I had a very sporadic history with it. I played a small campaign when I was 11, 12 years old in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I really loved it because I loved fantasy and I loved the artwork and all the things that came with that. That's what really brought me in, drew me into the game, and I really liked it. Sporadically dabbled with other editions, and I didn't really like how crunchy it got. At that time, I was unaware of there being a larger tabletop community. Also, I moved around quite a bit. Didn't really work out for me that way. It wasn't until 2007 when a buddy of mine, my buddy Zach, big shout out to you, invited me to a game he was running. I believe it was 4th edition. I'm not sure, but it was pretty homebrewed, and the core system we were using was pretty similar and familiar to me. So it rekindled my passion for fantasy and my love of tabletop games. That ended around 2008, and it wasn't until 2016 where I picked up the starter set for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and my GMing, career or hobby started. I really enjoyed playing the Phandelver adventure. I ran that for multiple groups, multiple people, and I really enjoyed it, and that's where I found my love of GMing, and I've been doing that ever since, of course. So what did I learn with all that? Number one, I found that GMing was fun, but I started to see the holes in the rules to Dungeons and Dragons, which, again, I still consider Dungeons and Dragons to be a rules medium game, really, personally. And again, there might be controversy there. I don't know. That's just the way I see it. I found that it was becoming just cumbersome, especially the amount of homebrewing I had to do to make it what I felt playable and runnable in a way that made sense. There's so much stuff I had to drop from the rule book. I had to use a lot of the optional rules. I pulled in rules from other games, which there's nothing wrong with that, but I had to do a lot of that there, where my version of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition was nothing like the rule book said. Things in specific were some of the other rules. I don't like the way magic works a lot. I'm not big into the Vantian magic system. I almost think there's too much of it. I didn't like the fact that arcane and divine magic were essentially the same thing. I like those things to be divided out. I think they should be different, personally. I didn't think some of the classes were written very well. I'm looking at rangers, monks, the most here, but other ones, warlocks, I think suffered quite a bit. And frankly, I just thought that almost all the classes should have been better. I honestly thought monks and barbarians should have been subclasses of fighters. There's just a lot of things that I just thought kind of made the game more cumbersome than need be. I'm also not a big fan of the way they handle races in the game. Now, races in itself is a word that I'm not a big fan of, and we can go into that another time. But I don't like the way they handle it so much in the game. And even the way that they combined with the classes, to me, it didn't make a lot of sense, really. And the lore that the game itself had was just so convoluted. It just became a little bit cumbersome and too much for me personally. That's when I started looking into other games in about 2018. So as I'm playing this, I'm also dabbling in other games. Then the OGL scandal happens. And as I stated in my intro video, and is hopefully going to be a ringing thing through my entire channel, I'm a big fan of third-party creators and artists. And the OGL to me was a direct kick in the face to those people. And it was at that time that after all my problems with the rules, the expense of the books, the OGL happened. That was it for me. I cut my ties with Dungeons and Dragons as a name brand 100% then, and I've never looked back. And frankly, I've had a lot more fun since. And again, this is just my take on it, but I want to give a lot of thanks to Professor DM on Dungeon Craft and all the other people in the community, whether we're on YouTube or not, that joined me in leaving D&D Beyond, leaving the accounts behind during that time, because I was already going to do that, and that was just the nail in the coffin for me. So to everybody else that did that, if you were one of those people, thank you for standing up. Thank you for being part of our community. And hopefully my channel will be a catalyst for you to want to engage in that community a little bit more. But yeah, definitely not looking back to Dungeons and Dragons. So what I want to talk about now is how do you make the game better? And what do I mean by better? So by better, I mean you make the game more deadly. If I wanted to play a superhero tabletop games, they already have games that do that. I don't look to fantasy to play superheroes. I want to play either regular people that become heroes or just plain like derelicts of society that are trying to make it through. You know, those are the things I like the best. So I like it. Death needs to be present. So to make it better, I think it should be more deadly. I think magic should be dangerous or difficult, one or the other. I also think it should be rather limited. I found D&D to have a lot of spells, which almost seem to be too much, in my opinion. And we can get into that deeper in other videos. But let's just say I think magic should be dangerous, more difficult, not only to possess, but to find. So I didn't think that Dungeons and Dragons did that very well. Like I said before a little bit, I like the PCs to be more like regular folks, as heroes versus superheroes. Heroes being that their hero-ship, as it were, is earned as opposed to given superpowers and now you have to do something for it. I think in fantasy especially, you're really more of a hero than a superhero. So I like to keep it that way. Regular folks becoming things. And then, of course, having to address all the other kind of socially awkward issues, I guess would be the best way to put it. And having to deal with that and having to rewrite so much of it. When I say make it better, I mean you address these things. You make it more deadly. You make the magic more dangerous and difficult. You make the PCs more like regular folks who earn herodom or heroship or earn their place to be called that. I prefer it to be simplified, especially when it comes to being the GM, to simplify it. And of course, to address sensitive matters. So how did I do that? Well, one of the things I did is there was just things I didn't do. I didn't use the CR rating at all. I found it to be absolutely useless, to be honest with you. I didn't like it at all. I didn't always pay attention to the class restrictions. For example, I gave monks more key points at earlier levels because I felt they were just too weak. I also would often give them a bonus to their dexterity. It just depends on the situation. I didn't feel that fixed it at all. It just helped make them better. So that's just an example. But I also only use the classes and the subclasses that I felt fit the story that was being told. I would limit races and classes, and something I advocate for you GMs. It's okay to limit choices if it makes sense for the story you're telling. Don't let people tell you otherwise. If somebody gets mad about it, they're just not ready for that game or they don't want to play in that game, and that's okay. Stick to your guns when it comes to that, GM. Some of the books that I use and some of the things I recommend, other than just dropping the stuff you don't want to use, adding in rules that you might find from other systems or that you hear that make it better, I recommend a few other supplements. One of them, Xanathars. I feel this was the only supplement to 5th edition that was good. And I know I'll get some hate for that because some people really like Tasha's. I'm sorry, for me, Xanathar's made some of the classes by giving them subclasses that made sense and that were actually kind of cool. It gave you some other rules and spell ideas that were really good. I think this is one of the only things that that was written for 5th edition that was worth it as far as I'm concerned. So if you're playing 5th edition, get Xanathar's. All right, it's worth it. It does help make some of the classes better. Granted, you usually have to wait till 3rd level to do that, but hey, you can just start them at 3rd level and give them their subclass right away, call it good. I highly recommend Xanathar's if you're going to get official stuff. Now, for supplementary stuff, again, the whole race thing in 5e is always weird. I really liked what these guys did. This is the Arcanist Press. They did the ancestry and culture. This is an alternative way of looking at that, and I think they did a pretty good job with it. They give you some really good options to create your own stuff, which I'm always a big fan of. And I really like the fact they do the pencil artwork. That's always something I'm a big fan of. So good job to these guys. There's other ones I've seen that try to do the same thing. To me, these guys did it the best and in a way that made the most sense and was the simplest to kind of pick up and run with. So I recommend that one. And finally, if you really want to make the game a little gritty and simplify it down, 5e hardcore mode. This is by Runehammer Games, and this is the supplement if you want to make 5th edition seem more like an old school game. I highly, highly recommend this supplement. This might also be a wonderful way to get your players to start considering different games, because once they start to see what the old school is like, now you can start slipping in, maybe we play Shadow Dark. Hey, let's play Old School Essentials. Basic Fantasy is pretty close to this. You know, it'd be a great way to introduce players that are stubborn and don't want to leave 5th edition into other games as well. If they're willing to take this supplement onto the game, it's a great way to introduce it. Highly, highly recommend it. We'll go over Runehammer Games in a different video, but for 5th edition, this is the thing. I would actually recommend this over everything else. Slap that on there. Use those rules to supplement this game, and you'll have a lot more fun, especially for GMs. That's just my opinion. But again, that's making it better from my point of view. That all being said, this game will not be used as anything but a comparison or a talking point maybe in the future. I will not cover this game any longer. Adventures, news on it, anything like that, it's not my concern. There's other people that do that stuff very well. And I've recommended channels before, and I will continue to as I go on, and I recommend you check those channels out for that kind of news. I didn't end up liking the system. I still feel that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and earlier versions are better, personally, and I think the games that took from that era and ran with it are some of the best games, and some of the other games that are just rules light that are based off of D20 just simply do the game better. Again, that's my opinion. If you are with that opinion, let's talk about the games we do like and how we can play those and the different scenarios we can get our players into with a little bit more simplicity and a lot less what I feel to be stress, because this game ended up being kind of stressful in its own ways, I feel, for all the reasons I talked about in this video. But hey, shout out to you once again if you were part of the group that left D&D Beyond during the OGL scandal and just basically told corporations, hey, you can do your thing, but we're going to do ours. So if you're part of that community, join me down below. Remember, everybody, I'm the Motley GM. I like to keep things simple, and I like to make sure that we play for fun first. Thanks for watching, everybody.